Chapter 50. A harsh reality. You are listening at Novel Full. Audio. A ear-piercing round of screams first sounded, then all sorts of noises followed, coming from a house on the left side of the alley. After a while, Beecher and the others came out dragging a bedraggled Claude, who wasn't quite there. Irene's face was full of rage as she grimly lectured Claude while staring at him. She spoke vehemently, "Claude, you're disgusting. I never want to see you again. Katie, let's go." With the way that things had developed, Han Shoa knew that his revenge had been exacted and that there was no further need to stick around. When he saw Irene and Katie walking quickly in his direction, he hastily hid himself and leisurely made his way back to the hotel. Back in the hotel, Han Shoa washed up and then sat cross-legged on the bed to practice magic. The magical yuan slowly expanded his meridians inch by inch. Han Shoa grit his teeth against the heart-wrenching pain and continuously circulated his magical yuan according to the instructions of the Open Passages realm. Unbearable pain often accompanied the process of practicing magic. This caused Han Shoa's personality to shift from its previously lackadaisicalness to firmly resolute. Whether it was his willpower or ability to stoically endure pain, Han Shoa had significantly increased both. Han Shoa's entire personality and character had unknowingly continuously changed with the advent of practicing magic. As his strength slowly increased, the previously timid and cowering Han Shoa had already experienced great changes. The way he viewed and understood things were vastly different from the thoughts that he had held prior. A solid, dull footstep suddenly sounded in Han Shoa's heart. Han Shoa abruptly stopped all magic practice, held his breath, and concentrated. All his bodily functions instantaneously sank into a frozen and unmoving status. The footsteps that had sounded until now had been from the southern intersection of the town of Droll and the dark forest. Based on the dullness and rhythm of the thumps, Han Shoa could draw the conclusion that this came from a magical creature with high speed. This creature's weight was definitely heavier than a battle steed, and their numbers consisted of more than a few. Creasing his brow, Han Shoa thought for a while and walked out of the hotel, slowly moving towards the direction of the magical creatures, wanting to see what the situation was. Just as Han Shoa had emerged from the hotel and arrived at the southern streets of Droll, two figures had also rushed over with a look of haste. It was an elderly, thin wizard and a female elven archer with green-tipped ears. The two displayed expressions of shock seeing Han Shoa upon arrival, as if they hadn't thought that Han Shoa would be here. "Little fellow, what are you doing here?" The thin, small wizard gazed at Han Shoa and asked with a smile. From their cautious attitudes, Han Shoa understood that they had most likely also detected the disturbance coming from the south. Weighing things up internally, Han Shoa made a slight bow and responded, "Noble wizard, I've become separated from my companions. They said they would return here after a few days, so I've been waiting here." The wizard nodded and frowned in consideration. He said to the female elven archer next to him, "Blanche, go scout and see if it's wolf riders from the orcs. They always send wolf riders every year before winter to raid and loot the villages on the outer edge of the empire. But the town of Droll is in a unique location and is filled with large quantities of adventurers and mercenaries. The orcs had never sent wolf riders to attack Droll, why would they act so oddly this time? Not to mention that there was still quite a bit of time before winter." "Yes, Master Felix." Upon hearing the old wizard Felix's words, the female elven archer called Blanche immediately headed south, floating in front of Han Shoa like a gust of wind. "Little fellow, the town of Droll isn't a peaceful place. It's late at night, so you should head back early to rest. Your companions should come looking for you when they return, so there's no need to continue waiting here." Felix looked at Han Shoa with a smile as he tried to convince Han Shoa. "All right, then I'll be heading back now." Han Shoa responded calmly and started picking his way back as soon as he'd finished speaking. After Han Shoa had left, Felix mused as he stared oddly at Han Shoa's retreating figure. He finally murmured to himself after a while. I must be overthinking the situation. There's no way that this kid is more perceptive me. A wind archmage on his way back to his hotel, Han Shuan noticed that a few others walked out from nearby hotels with the same surprised expression, hastily making their way to the southern street. It looks like they too had detected the disturbance and had gone to the southern street to check things out. Brian, I have some matters with you. Come here for a second. On the way back, Han Shuo bumped into Claude on the street to the hotel. Claude's face was heavily overcast, and it appeared that he was in an exceedingly bad mood. His heart skipping a beat, Han Shuo had a vague premonition of unease. He could strongly feel repressed rage emanating from Claude. Although Claude looked at him with a calm gaze, his teeth were gnashing slightly, still enabling Han Shuo to feel the strong ripples in his emotions. Staring at Claude dumbly, Han Shuo thought furiously. At this moment, Han Shuo understood that his actions in the hotel just now had still been too heavy-handed and impulsive. When Claude had sobered up, he would have surely detected his body's condition and certainly deduced that it was something caused by the purple ley line in the hotel. Claude wasn't a stupid person. Only Irene and Han Shuo had been at the table then, and Irene would never do anything like this. Connecting the dots to when the waiter suddenly tripped, Claude must have sussed out the entire situation. Okay. Han Shuo thought carefully and knew that the situation was bad. He was prepared for a brutal beating from Claude as he followed behind the knight, walking slowly out of Droll and arriving at a secluded patch of forest to the south of Droll. Moonlight filtered through the forest as bugs chirped lightly nearby. However, Han Shuo's sensitive ears were able to catch the low breathing from Claude's strongly repressed fury. Looks like it'll be quite a beating. Han Shuo thought wryly, but didn't feel too much fear. He had gotten used to the beatings during this time and knew his body's situation quite well. He knew that the usual type of blows would be unable to hurt him, so his heart was relatively calm. Pa! Just when he was thinking wryly, a ringing slap sent him staggering towards the left before he was able to react preventatively. It was a good thing that Han Shuo's body far outstripped normal people's. He steadied himself in the mess, regained his footing, and scrunched up his face as he smiled wryly at Claude. You damned lowly slave. Pig. Who do you think you are to scheme against me? Claude's firmly repressed anger had finally exploded. An ugly, vehement face stared at Han Shuo as his usual, sunny, gentlemanly demeanor had long since vanished above the clouds. Palapala. A wave of attacks rained down on Han Shuo's body. Han Shuo clutched at his head with both hands and didn't raise them to defend himself, taking the hits from Claude's thundering rage. He finally abruptly curled into a ball and fell to the ground, looking like he couldn't take any more hits. Well, does that hurt? I won't let you die so easily. Do you know who I am? I am Claude Asha, the son of the commander of the Empire's Griffin Legion, Commander Bob Asha. You lowly errand boy dares to scheme against me and ruin my relationship with Irene. I will make you experience agony and pain in full before letting you die slowly. Ahaha. Claude stared venomously at Han Shuo as he drew his long sword with a cold smile, walking slowly towards Han Shuo. Up until now, Han Shuo had finally understood that he had always committed a huge error. Whether it was Fitch or Bach, his methods had always embodied a large amount of risk. With his status as an errand slave, no matter who killed him, they wouldn't have to endure too much backlash. Even if Bach killed him, the Academy would probably only admonish him for a few words and demand a few gold coins in compensation. Han Shuo had originally thought that Claude would at most brutally beat him up for a prank like this, but the result now had finally facilitated Han Shuo in understanding the harsh reality. Claude not only wanted him to die this time, but also wanted him to fully experience agony and pain before dying. This was the harsh reality. At the moment, Han Shuo finally understood what kind of world this was. Status and position were a foundational, integral existence. A yawning difference in status existed between the two, allowing Claude to kill him without reservations and without a need to bear any particular responsibility. Claude had called him to this deserted forest because he didn't want to ruin his noble status and self. Even if he'd killed Han Shuo in Droll, it would have been quite matter of fact with no one thinking about it twice. Growth always came at a cost. Han Shuo curled up on the ground, still emitting loud wails and pleas for mercy. A heart, that only held vague thoughts of evil, slowly hardened with cold. I will dice you into several pieces, letting you wail as you bleed. You will slowly, fully experience pain before dying. Remember your status in your next life. You're a mere errand slave, a pig. Never attempt to challenge the temper of your superiors. Claude snickered sinisterly as the long sword in his hand pierced towards the chest of a Han Shuo who had seemed too long since losing the ability to defend himself. At this moment, the continuous howls suddenly disappeared as Han Shuo's curled figure abruptly moved, rolling towards Claude's feet. His speed was such that it caught Claude off guard. When Claude was about to dodge, he suddenly emitted a ghastly wail. A few iron needles stuck out from the tops of his feet, firmly nailing his feet to the ground. A wave of bone-cutting pain emanated from his lower abdomen. Claude lowered his head to find a dagger sticking out of his stomach. Han Shuo looked at him with a cold and distant gaze, the look in his eyes giving Claude a very foreign feeling. I am the son of the commander of the Griffin League. You damned errand slave, how dare you harm me? Claude's body was racked with pain as he yelled furiously with a weak voice. Thank you for letting me know the harsh truth of reality. It's because of your vaunted status that not only will I harm you, I'm going to kill you. After saying these words in a remote tone, another iron needle appeared in Han Shuo's right hand and directly pierced through Claude's throat amidst Claude's terror-filled screams. Chapter 51. The calm aftermath after killing someone. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. This wasn't the first time that Han Shuo had killed someone, but compared to killing forest trolls, the impact Han Shuo's heart received from slaughtering Claude was exceedingly great. After all, forest trolls were a different race from him, and were renowned robbers. Han Shuo killing them felt as natural as killing magical creatures, but Claude was completely different from them. Han Shuo had been forced to kill him because he knew within his heart that if Claude didn't die, Han Shuo could put all thoughts of peacefully living his life in the future out of his mind. Watching Claude weaken and sag into a pool of blood, Han Shuo felt a bit numb in that moment. There was an empty feeling in his heart. He hadn't hesitated when he made his move, and it was only when he watched Claude die in front of him that a feeling of nervousness grew in Han Shuo. Claude was a noble, and the youngest son of the commander of the Empire's Griffin Legion. If news of this matter leaked, only death awaited Han Shuo. Gazing at Claude's corpse, Han Shuo stared dumbly into space for a while. His originally slightly panicked expression became more and more resolute and harshly cold. Finally, Han Shuo rearranged his clothes and stood up, walking up to Claude with a calm face and rummaging through his clothes. He poured out a few gold coins from his money bag, a crystal card, and some scattered medicine. After thinking for a bit, Han Shuo only put away the gold coins. He set aside the potentially incriminating crystal card and Claude's other belongings. A little skeleton, wielding a bone knife, appeared in front of Han Shuo after his incantation had finished. Han Shuo searched out a desolate clearing as one man and one skeleton wielded bone knife and dagger spent a few minutes digging a deep hole. After burying Claude in the hole, Han Shuo carefully cleaned up the traces of blood that Claude had left behind. He even slowly covered up the traces in which he'd fallen down and rolled around. Circling around the forest patch and confirming that no clues had been left behind, Han Shuo did not return along the original way. Rather, he made an additional circle and dug a deep hole to the north of Droll, burying all of Claude's belongings. Finally, he returned to Droll using another street. He did all this because he was careful and cautious. They hadn't garnered anyone's attention on the way to the forest with Claude earlier because Claude had intentionally done so. Now that Han Shuo had killed him and carefully buried his body, logically speaking, no one should discover it. Even if someone unintentionally discovered Claude's body, Han Shoa had taken all the belongings off the body, creating the impression of murder in the course of robbery. These things happened quite often in the town of Droll and should be able to conceal the original reason of death. After Han Shoa had dealt with these loose ends, he concealed himself in the surroundings of the hotel of Irene and the others for the next 2 days, silently observing the movements of the light major students. He discovered that whether it was Irene or Beecher, none of them came looking for Claude. It looked like they thought that Claude had wronged them first and so left him alone. Claude was certainly the one who understood his bodily condition the most. No matter how he tried to explain under those circumstances, it was more than likely that not many would believe his words, and judging from the timing in which Claude had come for him and his understanding of the psychedelic aphrodisiac, he more or less surmised that Claude had come looking for revenge as soon as he'd sobered up, and hadn't had time to explain anything to Irene or Beecher. After 2 days of observation, Han Shoa finally relaxed and let down his guard upon seeing that Irene and Beecher made no moves to look for Claude and only focused their attentions on spending money as they visited various weapons and armor vendors as well as pharmacists. At dusk on this night, Han Shoa did not venture out again to keep an eye on Irene and Beecher, but instead stayed inside to quietly practice magic. He repeatedly expanded the width of his body's meridians and improved their pliability. Han Shoa was seated primly on the edge of his bed, completely naked, sweat pouring down his entire body, starting from his forehead. The tendons of his body jumped as they bulged out like endless numbers of worms moving through the surface of his body. It looked even more cringe-worthy and scary than even the most evil tattoo. During this entire process, a sudden tremor ran through Han Shoa's mind as he sank into a senseless realm. For the moment, he forgot himself, forgot time, and was like a sculpture, without life. Only a faint hint of black splendor circulated beneath his skin. Dondindin. A sudden round of fierce knocking abruptly awakened Han Shoa. When Han Shoa came back to himself, he took stock of himself internally and understood that he must have unknowingly sunk into the demonic mental state just now. Dondindin. The knocking was still continuing and Han Shoa was a bit irritated that his training had been interrupted. He grabbed a random towel and wrapped it around himself, saying with irritation, "Coming. Coming." When the door was opened, Han Shoa received the shock of his life. The irritable expression on his face vanished without a trace as it immediately transformed into a smiling face. He said merrily, "It's you guys. I've been waiting a long time for you. You've finally come back." Standing outside the door, Fanny and Lisa looked a bit worn out and their hair was a bit messed up. They carried items in the hands and packs on their back, looking quite tired from the road. It appeared that they'd just returned from the dark forest. "You Brian, you actually made it back to Droll such a long time ago. We were worried about you for quite a while. Oh, how'd you get money to live in such an expensive room? If it wasn't for the owner's certainty, I truly wouldn't have believed that you were the one living in this room." Fanny's clear eyes swept over Han Shoa and she spoke with a bit of a bite to her words. "Brian, what happened the day you left? You didn't return for 2 days and I thought something happened to you." Lisa said. "I got lost after I left, and when I found the original camp, I discovered that you'd long since left. I couldn't find you guys, so I went one step ahead and returned to the town of Droll to wait for you. Good thing that everyone is fine." "That's wonderful." Han Shoa smiled slightly and faintly explained himself. Fanny raked a gaze over Han Shoa, thought for a moment and spoke to Lisa beside her. "Lisa, go and finish arranging the rooms with Master Jean and the rest. I have some things to discuss with Brian." Lisa looked at Fanny with some suspicion and said, "Master Fanny, that incident has passed for quite some time now. Brian even saved our lives. Are you still holding a grudge against him?" Her face reddened when Fanny heard Lisa mention last time's incident again. She said furiously, "No, I have other things to discuss with him. Go select a room for me and I'll be over shortly." Lisa still wasn't fully at ease upon hearing Fanny's explanation, but didn't say anything further as she turned to leave, muttering something in her mouth. As soon as Lisa had left, Fanny raked her gaze over Han Shoa and looked at the room she'd once lived in, seeming to remember what had happened last time as her cheeks flushed even redder. She humphed lightly and said, "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Master Fanny, this way please." Han Shoa was taken aback and hurriedly turned his body to the side. When Fanny had stepped inside, he stuck a head out for a look in the hallway and hastily shut the door tight, like he was acting with a guilty conscience. "What are you doing so surreptitiously? I ask you, what happened the day after you left camp? How do you have the gold coins to stay in this room?" Fanny nailed Han Shoa with a patrolling look after she sat down. Han Shoa still hadn't fully recovered from killing Claude. Upon hearing Fanny's words, he was a bit surprised. He thought for a bit and then explained with a laugh, "When I left the camp that day, I stayed nearby practicing necromancy magic. I met an injured Windblade Wolf afterwards. I kept chasing the injured Windblade Wolf and finally killed it when it wasn't paying attention. When I returned to the camp, I made my way back here after I realized that you had gone. After returning to Droll, I sold the Windblade Wolf core and pelt. That's how I got the gold coins. I thought that you guys would likely be staying here again after returning, which is why I rented the room to wait for you guys. This is what happened." Fanny didn't immediately speak after Han Shoa had finished, but rather gazed upon Han Shoa in apparent thought. She exhaled lightly after a while, "Brian, you're truly completely different from before." He started and managed to squeeze out an honest smile. He scratched his head, "Really? Where am I different?" "In many ways. Your appearance, body, and height, as well as your personality and expressions when you talk are all much too different from how I knew you before. It looks like you were the one who changed the most after experiencing the trials of the Dark Forest. All the students have undergone some changes after constantly facing battles of life and death, but who would have thought that your change would have been the biggest? How shocking." Fanny stared dumbly at Han Shoa and said with a face of severity. Han Shoa understood that during this time's outing in the Dark Forest, unbeknownst to him, a change had truly occurred in the way he viewed things. This change had accompanied the increases in his strength and the dangers that he had faced. After killing Claude with his own hands the day before yesterday and a serious round of reflection, Han Shoa had gained a clearer understanding of the harsh realities of this world, and with it, his heart had become colder and crueler. "Master Fanny, you left a note saying that you guys had met the two man-eating monsters. Did you get into a conflict with them in the end?" Han Shoa laughed lightly and didn't explain things in further detail, but rather started asking Fanny what had happened to them afterwards. "Of course, the two man-eating monsters kept following us. They even colluded with a few forest trolls to attack us. We finally made it out, but our paths were deviated significantly from our original direction because we were avoiding the man-eating monsters and the forest trolls. That's why we returned to Droll so late." Fanny responded. Nodding, Han Shoa was about to open his mouth, when he suddenly frowned and abruptly stood up. He said with a face full of seriousness, "Looks like we've got trouble. Everyone on alert. The Orc Wolf Riders have appeared in the southern part of Droll. They are headed this way, everyone make ready for battle." Large yells suddenly sounded from the streets outside the hotel, all having to do with the imminent invasion from the Orc Wolf Riders. Chapter 52. Wolf Riders Invade. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Han Shoa had been talking with Fanny when he immediately yelled upon hearing the voices ringing out from outside, "Master Fanny, let's hurry and meet up with them." Fanny didn't mince words and started for the door to Han Shoa's room in a rush as soon as his voice had sounded. After Fanny had left, Han Shoa randomly flung off the bathrobe that had been wrapped around his body and quickly put on his clothes. He carefully put away the iron needles, dagger, crossbow, and bottles of medicine he'd bought over the past few days and finally left the room. Adventurers darting bodies and merchants loudly calling voices were apparent all over the main street. These people had been drinking in their hotels or enjoying themselves in places of temptation, but they had all immediately left their rooms when they heard news of the Wolf Riders' invasion and surged onto the main street. Adventurers and mercenaries all lived their lives on the edge, living on the edge of a knife's blade, and so were long used to such dangers. When they left their rooms, they all methodically organized their weapons and armor, congregating onto the South Street according to the origin of the voices. Han Shuo walked out from the room and realized that even the hotel owner had grabbed a longsword when he'd walked back to the front desk of the hotel. The owner was standing in front of the door with a fierce expression on his face. It seemed that the citizens of Droll were indeed fierce and valorous. Fanny and the others were all standing in front of the door. All the students hastily put their belongings down in the room and hurriedly rushed out again. After the adventure to the dark forest, these young, sapling mages had learned how to be composed and self-possessed, and didn't cry out randomly in panic. "Brian, hurry and come over here. We must set out for South Street immediately. Since Orc Wolf Riders dare to invade the Empire's town of Droll, we mustn't let them succeed." Lisa immediately raised her hand high and called out as soon as she saw Han Shuo appear, as if deathly afraid that Han Shuo wouldn't be able to see her. Apart from Fanny and the others in front of the hotel doors, a couple other adventurers and mercenaries had also formed into groups of 3 to 5 people. The necromancy students continued to walk out of their rooms. Each one was armed to the teeth and bristling with weaponry. Fanny counted heads shortly after Han Shuo had made his way toward Lisa's side. When she discovered that they were all accounted for, she immediately shouted, "Follow me to South Street and don't get separated." Han Shuo followed behind Fanny on a main street crowded with figures, arriving at South Street shortly thereafter. When they'd arrived, Han Shuo saw that almost 100 adventurers and mercenaries were nearby. The old mage, Felix, and female elf, Blanche, that Han Shuo had seen last time were also there. Judging from the way things looked, they were acting as leaders. Felix was hovering in the air and was loudly shouting something. This old mage can hover in midair using levitation magic. It looks like he must be at least of the Archmage level." Jean exclaimed in shock after they'd arrived and started explaining to the students. When a mage trains to a certain realm, she will be able to use levitation magic to fly. However, only mages who've reached the Archmage level can cast levitation magic. Therefore, mages who can fly are all without a doubt noble and exceedingly powerful characters. Brave warriors of the Empire, the Orcs Wolf Riders are moving towards the town of Droll. According to my observations, the Wolf Riders are moving in a formation of 500. As an encampment of the Empire, our town of Droll has zero tolerance for being trampled on by these savages. Warriors, raise your weapons and give them a taste of the fury of the Empire's warriors. Felix hovered in midair and clutched an exquisite magic staff, embedded with sapphires, in his right hand, speaking loudly to raise morale. Aren't these the people from the necromancy major? Fancy meeting you here. Beecher's voice suddenly sounded from the side at this moment. Han Shuo twisted his head to see that the light major students had all cast their eyes this way. "Hello Master Beecher, to think we would run into you here. I trust that you have gained rich rewards from this time's outing." Jean nodded and smiled in greeting, asking his questions afterwards. "Nothing much, no big rewards, just that the students have truly improved." Beecher responded faintly with a smile. Dull, thudding sounds, that originated from the south, sounded in the distance. Under the instructions of Felix and Blanche, the warriors had long since armed themselves and bristled with weaponry as they stood in the front. Mages, archers, and priests stood in the back, separated from the warriors by a distance of 5 to 6 meters. They had taken their magic staffs and gazed intently towards the south with grave expressions. Seeing that everyone had assumed their positions, Beecher and Jean didn't waste time in furthering their idle chit-chat, instead moving to stand with the mages. Although Han Shuo's body had greatly improved, he wasn't so dumb as to stand in the front and draw attention to himself. He too followed Fanny and stood with the mages. Just as everyone had taken up their respective positions according to profession, dull, clopping sounds sounded like dull drums in the hearts of the assembled people. A concentrated, heavy sense of strong aura slowly found its way into everyone's hearts. The wolf-riding orc wolf riders slowly materialized out of the flying dust cloud and into everyone's vision. A grave, killing aura immediately enveloped the entire town of Droll. The wolf riders immediately started charging forward as soon as they'd appeared, accompanied by sharp howls and screams. The long swords in their hands flashed with cold light, and the strong flare of aura from 500 wolf riders charging in union immediately gave others a strong sense of oppression. Mages ready, release your magic on my mark. Felix was relatively calm as he hovered in the air, gazing down on the wolf riders. He spoke calmly only when the wolf riders had truly started charging. Everyone be careful. Don't let anything happen to you. Fanny was also a bit nervous at this moment and she turned to give a few reminders to the student standing next to her. Just as Fanny was about to remind Han Shuo, she suddenly discovered that there was a type of numbing, cold severity in his eyes that were set in a face of calm. There was no panic at all. He gripped a sharp dagger in his hand, and a frigid aura slowly started emanating from the dagger. Noticing Fanny's gaze, Han Shuo's concentration lapsed and the bone-piercing, frigidly cold aura that he had infused the dagger with as a result of guiding the magical yuan in his left hand into the dagger after activating the mystical glacial spellfire suddenly faded away, without a trace. Is something the matter, Master Fanny? Han Shuo looked at Fanny and asked with an honest smile hanging on his face once again. No, nothing. You be careful. Fanny looked at Han Shuo and responded in a bit of a weird tone. At this moment, Fanny had finally realized that the honest, dumb smile that Han Shuo had worn on his face was merely his disguise. The calmness and composure that he had while facing danger was most likely Han Shuo's true state. Damn it, you lied to everyone. I'll make you pay for that sooner or later. Fanny thought fiercely in her heart on one hand, and on the other surreptitiously appraised Han Shuo, suddenly feeling that a calmly serious Han Shuo had a very different quality to him. Chapter 53. The Perils of the Town of Droll. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Loose. Felix's high call drew open the curtains for magic attacks. Suddenly, all the mages next to Han Shuo and the others started chanting magical incantations. A column of sharp wind blades, multiple large, blazing fireballs, several ice bolts shaped like spikes, lightning landing violently from the skies, and even the long swords from the light major students all abruptly appeared, rushing towards the charging wolf riders. Fanny and Jean also chanted their incantations and skeletons and zombies staggered out, one after another. They ran out from the side of the foremost warriors and rushed at the wolf riders. The orcs on the backs of wolves were engulfed in magic in an instant and suffered brutal blows. Beneath the howling of the wind blades, multiple injuries appeared on the wolf riders and the large wolves they rode on. When the large fireballs came crashing down, several wolf riders were completely swallowed up by the blazing fire. Soon after, the ice bolts and lightning also took down 10 or so wolf rider lives. However, there were 500 or so wolf riders. When this wave of magic came crashing down, it only killed the 30 or 40 wolf riders in the very front. The rest of the wolf riders did not display the slightest hint of fear or cowardice upon seeing their companions die. They continued to thunder forward in excitement, caring not a whit for their deaths. Just as the mages were about to sing the second wave of magical incantations, crossbows appeared unbeknownst to anyone in the hands of the charging wolf riders. They raised the crossbows and clouds of sharp arrows flew like the wind, soaring over the first row of heavily armored warriors and making for the mages and archers. Everyone be careful. The elven archer, Blanche, called out in a melodious voice, also directing the archers to counterattack. The mages had been chanting incantations, planning to attack the wolf riders. When they saw the sharp arrows flying towards themselves, they immediately changed the direction of the magical attacks and released waves of magic to crash down onto the arrows in the midair, destroying them before they could strike their targets. However, not all the sharp arrows were destroyed by magic. 10 or so sharp missiles still shot down, and the strong force behind them immediately pierced 2 Thunder novice mages to death. 3 or so mages more or less suffered some sort of injuries. At this moment, the 3 priests suddenly started singing healing incantations, taking care of the 3 injured mages. Because this wave of magic had all been used on countering the sharp arrows, the wolf riders hadn't suffered much damage. They rushed over with an even faster speed. The large wolves charged over with an extremely fierce aura. The skeletons and zombies, that bore the initial brunt of the attacks, were demolished within seconds. Beneath the charge of the large wolves, the lowest-level skeletal warriors were abruptly trampled into bits of bone and didn't have much effect at all. The zombie warriors stood up to the onslaught for a brief moment, but under the slices of the orcs' longswords, the heads of 10 or so zombie warriors were simultaneously sent flying as they fell to the ground. Humph! The dark creatures of the Necromancy Major are indeed useless. Upon seeing that the dark creatures from the Necromancy Major weren't having much effect, Irene and a few other light major students started jeering at them. Han Shoa grasped a dagger in his hand, his entire being still calm and composed. His eyes gazed at the figures of the wolf riders in the distance, completely ignoring the mockery coming from Irene and the light major students. The crossbows in the wolf riders' hands rose again, and another hail of arrows rained down. The mages in the back all used magic to defend themselves. A couple mages with more training destroyed the sharp arrows that flew towards them and were still able to continuously release magic to attack the wolf riders careening towards them. 5 sharp arrows suddenly shot over with a whooshing sound, heading towards the students of the Necromancy Major. Fanny and Jean's facial expressions changed as they both sent out bone arrows, destroying 3 of them in midair. One of them had veered off course and shot towards a corner in which no one was standing, whereas the other made a beeline for Amy. At this moment, Amy became panicked and started chanting magic. Jean and Fanny were also a bit anxious and also started to swiftly chant magic, but the speed in which they all chanted at was obviously slower than the speed of the sharp arrow. A dagger suddenly drew a cold line through the air and flew into the sky like a bolt of lightning. A sharp crack sounded out as the arrow that had been flying towards Amy broke into several pieces. At the same moment, Han Shoa's body suddenly squirmed out, stopping in front of Amy and catching the dagger before it landed on the ground. "Thank you, Brian." Amy smiled widely after the crisis had been averted and was full of gratitude towards Han Shoa. "You're welcome." Han Shoa nodded with a faint smile, returning once again to Fanny and Lisa's side with dagger in hand, surveying the surroundings with a face full of calm. Finally, after paying the price of 70 injured or dead wolf riders, the wolf riders broke through the constant waves of magic attacks and came into direct conflict with the warriors of Droll. A large battle suddenly commenced with 50 to 60 warriors armed to the teeth, wielding broadswords and long spears. There were even 10 or so knights wielding lances, fighting with the wolf riders from the back of their battle steeds. The mages chanted their magics as they flew across the air in glorious sparkles, landing on the wolf riders in the back. The entire southern part of the town of Droll had sunken into the heat of battle amidst the sounds of violent explosions. Han Shoa, Fanny, and the others were situated behind the warriors and continuously chanted magic. Bolt after bolt of bone spears and arrows flew out towards the orc wolf riders that were charging at the defensive line of warriors. Felix, hovering in midair, became the main target of all the orc wolf rider crossbows. More than 10 sharp bolts came whistling towards him, but Felix showed no trace of panic. He chanted an advanced wind magic after which a 10-meter tornado formed in the air behind the wolf riders. Wolf riders were swallowed up wherever the tornado touched, and ghastly screams and wails sounded endlessly. After the tornado had appeared, Felix gave a wave of the magic staff in his hand and more than 10 wind blades instantaneously flew out from his body, demolishing the sharp bolts that flew to him. At the same time, a magic shield appeared and completely covered him. The few sharp missiles that finally made it past his magic were blocked by the magic shield. Felix didn't suffer any harm to his body whatsoever. So strong. That's the true power of a mage. The light students were watching Felix's relaxed expressions besides Han Shoa, and all of them displayed expressions of adoration and worship as they sighed with emotions. Just as everyone was reflecting on how amazing Felix was, the previously relaxed Felix suddenly gave a great yell. Oh dear, more wolf riders have appeared in the distance. There also seems to be a few orc shamans with them. Let's retreat. Everyone split up and make for the city of Zajoski. Felix's words immediately had a huge impact on everyone assembled. Han Shoa was the first to react as he grabbed Fanny's small hand and said calmly, "Follow me, hurry." Fanny was startled, and when she saw Han Shoa's gravely calm expression, the curses that had made their way to her mouth transformed into, "All right, but where do you want to go?" "To where the battle steeds are kept. We must hurry and find the battle steeds. Only on the backs of horses will we have the chance to escape to Zajoski, otherwise it will be difficult to guarantee our escape from the grasp of the wolf riders." Han Shoa's mind was thinking very quickly at this moment, and he spoke with decisiveness and grim determination. Fanny immediately reacted likewise when she heard Han Shoa's explanations, calling out hurriedly, "All students, follow me." Han Shoa knew that Fanny agreed with his plan when he heard her call out. He turned his head to see Lisa looking covetously at the hand that he'd used to grab Fanny's small hand. Han Shoa's expression turned wry as he also reached out a hand to grasp Lisa's hand. He then paid no attention to either of their expressions and hauled them off to where the battle steeds were kept. Chapter 54. Dog Eat Dog. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Because of Felix's words, the originally smoothly cooperating warriors and mages, that were defending against the orc wolf riders, abruptly sank into panic. People started becoming distracted from defense and instead frantically contemplated their means of escape. In the span of a moment, an impregnable defense collapsed. Apart from the warriors in the front, who were fighting as they retreated, the mages and the archers panicked and escaped in all directions. Han Shoa had grabbed Fanny and Lisa's wrists and was forcefully hauling the two with great haste to where the battle steeds were stabled. Behind Han Shoa, Jean directed the other necromancy major students to follow closely behind him. After a few rounds of life and death battles, Han Shoa was no longer naive nor terror-stricken when faced with danger. He quietly thought of what actions he should take next as he calmly sped forward. Also retreating with Han Shoa and the others, like tidewaters, were a few other mages and archers. If these people blocked Han Shoa's forward movement, they would have been shoved to the side without a moment's hesitation. The archers and mages were hard-pressed to increase their speed in the chaos of the crowd. Somehow, with Han Shoa as a meat shield, they managed to rush to the front after a moment's work. After 15 minutes, Han Shoa had finally hauled Fanny and Lisa to where the battle steeds were stabled, with Jean and the others following far behind. The master of the place had also gone to the southern streets to observe the earlier events and had only left a servant inside to watch over the horses. Han Shoa directly broke down the door and pulled Fanny and Lisa in the direction of the stables in the back. What are you doing? Just what are you doing? The elderly servant immediately stood up in a panic when he saw Han Shoa break down the door and rush towards the stables. He yelled angrily at them. The orc wolf riders have already fought their way here. If you continue to stay, you'll face only death. We're here to pick up the battle steeds that we've stabled here. If you want to live, then hurry, choose a battle steed, and flee. Han Shoa explained calmly as he rushed towards the stables. The elderly servant had already heard the chaos and commotion from outside at this time. He blanked for a second and then also made swiftly for the stables. It looked like he'd accepted Han Shoa's suggestion. Han Shoa finally released Fanny and Lisa's little hands and his eyes made a desperate sweep of the surroundings. His eyes landed on a handsome battle steed and vaulted onto its back without another word. He landed on the back of the horse in a second, swung the dagger in his hand, and slashed through the ropes that restrained the battle steed. He turned his head to find that Jean and some of the light major students had also made it to the stables. All were panting and joined Fanny and Lisa in looking for the horses they'd stabled here last time. "Are you all idiots? The Orc Wolf Riders will be here any second, what are you looking around for? Not to mention the battle steeds we stabled last time were all inferior beasts, there were only 6 of them. Do you want to die?" Han Shoa could finally hold in his impatience no longer and suddenly yelled out upon seeing that these people were still looking amongst the crowd of stabled battle steeds. Han Shoa's violent roar sounded throughout the stables. The necromancy students and teachers, who were looking for their battle steeds, were all lectured. They all froze in that moment. Han Shoa had called them idiots. It was a bit tough for them to accept that. "Then what do we do?" Lisa froze and then asked Han Shoa as she looked at him. "Choose the best, strongest battle steeds. We'll each take one. The lives of others have nothing to do with us. If you all want to die, then continue looking for the inferior battle steeds that we had." Han Shoa's face darkened as he resolutely called out. This was originally a simple concept, but the pity was that these necromancy students and teachers had always functioned in the necromancy major that encompassed a multitude of rules and customs. For them, following the rules was the natural thing to do. They hadn't thought at all about the fact that all rules could be broken in times of crisis. These people's faces all froze beneath Han Shoa's curses of idiots, which then changed to contemplative frowns as Han Shoa continued in the vein of paying no heed to the lives of others. His words caused another round of impact to these students and teachers who were used to following the rules. The commotion outside grew bigger and they made swift decisions when faced with a crisis of life or death. They no longer hesitated and ran over to the fiercest and most valiant battle steeds with looks of resolution. When the necromancy students and teachers had all occupied the best battle steeds in the stables under Han Shoa's urging, they rushed out of the stables. This was when the light major students from the academy and other clear-headed mages and archers finally made their way to the stables. "Damn it, they're riding our battle steeds." Irene's sharp eyesight immediately discovered that the handsome battle steed, that Han Shoa was currently riding on, was the one that she had ridden just days before. She immediately voiced a loud complaint. However, at this moment Han Shoa and the others were already riding on the fiercest battle steeds in the stables and had rushed out with due haste. They ignored the curses from Irene and the others and only left behind silhouettes that moved further and further away. "Brian, where should we go now?" Fanny immediately asked Han Shoa as soon as they'd left the stables and made it onto the chaotic streets. The warriors had already retreated into the town of Droll and the Orc Wolf Riders had rushed into town. Whirling their long swords mightily, the defenseless merchants were the first ones to suffer as they often lost their heads when the swords chopped down. Because these wolf riders were riding giant wolves, they were in no hurry to immediately pursue the escaping warriors and mages. They only followed the street and started looting the first stores they found. There were large bags hanging from the bodies of the giant wolves and the resources of all the surrounding stores made it into the bags of the giant wolves. "As long as it's not in the direction of Zajoski City, it doesn't matter where we flee to." Han Shoa surveyed the surroundings and swept a glance at the eastern street. He noticed that there were fewer people fleeing on the northern street, and called out after a moment's thought. "Follow me, we'll head north." Because the town of Droll was about to fall, the most heavily fortified city in the southern part of the empire, Zajoski City, became the ideal target in the hearts of the frantic escapees. Han Shoa observed for a moment and noticed that 70% of the people from the town of Droll were fleeing in the direction of Zajoski. However, out of this 70%, there were only 10 or so on battle steeds. When the Orc Wolf Riders had finished raiding the town of Droll, their first target was sure to be this crowd of people. With giant wolves as steeds, the Wolf Riders' speed was sure to be faster than those who were still on foot. Because the flow of people was 70% of the town's inhabitants, the orcs were sure to send the most wolf riders after them. In this way, the ones most likely to die were the 70% of people escaping in the direction of Zajoski. As soon as he'd started his calm deliberations, Han Shoa immediately realized that his thoughts were very clear. After a brief consideration, he immediately led battle steeds with Fanny and the others racing to the northern street. With the convenience of battle steeds, Han Shoa and company moved exceedingly fast. Han Shoa met two swift wolf riders, who'd come to the northern street, along the way. The bags on their giant wolves were bulging. They ignored Han Shoa's crew and were about to rush into another store to loot. Snorting coldly, Han Shoa lifted the reins and directed the battle steed beneath him to change its direction, charging towards the two wolf riders, who were raising their longswords with no abandon. The two wolf riders started. It seemed that they hadn't thought that someone would dare to take the offensive towards them. They withdrew the longswords that they've planned on slashing down on the shop's merchant and turned their bodies, abruptly splitting up. They waved the longswords in their hands and chopped towards the quickly approaching Han Shoa. "Brian, are you crazy? Run!" Lisa, off in the distance, saw that Han Shoa's battle steed had suddenly changed direction and was rushing towards the two wolf riders. She screamed out in panic and drew the attention of the necromancy students and teachers. They all involuntarily turned their heads and looked in Han Shoa's direction, wielding a dagger in his hand as his horse charged. Han Shoa quietly chanted a magical spell, and a bone arrow abruptly materialized in midair, whistling as it flew towards one of the wolf riders. As the wolf rider waved his long sword to defend himself, the dagger in Han Shoa's hand was already rushing towards the other wolf rider. The dagger drew a cold arc of light as it slashed the air and sank into bone with a soft sound. The dagger had passed through the longsword's defenses and pierced a bloody hole in the wolf rider's chest. At this moment, Han Shoa's battle steed had arrived in due haste. He clawed at the reins and the horse abruptly halted in the midst of violent whinnies. Han Shoa's left arm reached out and yanked up, suddenly dislodging the longsword from the orc, who was already dead. Wielding the longsword, Han Shoa's right hand sank down and a bloody hole suddenly opened in the head of the agitated giant wolf. The rioting giant wolf suddenly ragdolled as it fell to the ground. With a flick of the sword, the large pocket hanging on the giant wolf suddenly shot out from the fallen wolf, landing directly on Han Shoa's battle steed. Afterwards, Han Shoa's battle steed changed direction and he charged with a face of cold cruelty at the other wolf rider, who had just pulverized the bone arrow. "Oh my word, did I see incorrectly? Brian just cast the bone arrow magic. What the hell is going on?" Jean pulled tightly on his battle steed's reins and called out in with shock. The other students also bore a dumbfounded expression similar to Jean's, looking dully at Han Shoa like it was the first time they were meeting him. "Damn it, what is Brian doing?" Fanny had known that Han Shoa could cast bone arrow magic and thus wasn't too surprised. What she was surprised about was that Han Shoa's current actions were robbing the wolf riders after they had looted the stores. Chapter 55. A change in status. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The other wolf rider, upon seeing Han Shoa rush over wielding a longsword, forcefully widened his eyes that rested beneath his furry forehead. He roared furiously, obviously unpracticed in the common language, "Try. Tricky humans, you are. Looking for death." The giant wolf, beneath his legs, howled and the orc wolf rider whipped out a crossbow from behind him, raised it, and shot it at Han Shoa. It whistled with an ear-piercing sound as it flew towards Han Shoa's neck. His magical yuan churning quickly, Han Shoa focused his concentration. That sharply whistling crossbolt suddenly seemed to slow down in his eyes, as bizarre as the slow-motion scenes in the movies that Han Shoa used to watch. In stark contrast to the crossbow bolt's speed, was Han Shoa's strong and speedy perception. When the crossbolt had flown to about a meter away from Han Shoa, the long sword in his hand abruptly thrust out and it landed an unerringly accurate hit on the head of the bolt. A sharp crack resounded and the crossbolt suddenly exploded into pieces. Even after destroying the oncoming crossbow bolt, Han Shua's speed, although still on the back of the battle steed, wasn't affected at all. Before the Wolf Rider had the chance to fire off a second bolt, Han Shua had already raised his longsword and rushed in front of the Wolf Rider. The cold arc of a blade flared out from Han Shua's right hand, wielding the sword. The long sword had been solid and heavy, but it was as light and graceful as a feather in Han Shua's grasp. The Orc Wolf Rider also raised its sword, but just as the two swords were about to clash together, a smaller, brown crossbow bolt suddenly flew out from Han Shua's right sleeve. The crossbolt whooshed as it flew past the Orc's longsword and sank into the Orc Wolf Rider's neck with a soft sound. Treachery. Its mouth frothing with bloody bubbles, the Orc Wolf Rider finally spat out this word with much difficulty as the large hand, which had been holding up the long sword, suddenly lost strength. The heavy longsword brought down its fit and bulky body into falling off the huge wolf's back. It was obvious from the looks of things that it was dead. A race with low intelligence indeed. Han Shua's previously stern and cold expression vanished as he came to the side of the huge wolf with a face filled of traces of an evil smile. A flick of his longsword sent the bag on the huge wolf's body flying towards the battle steed behind him. Afterwards, the sword stabbed downwards and the giant wolf also toppled over in a pool of blood. Kill, kill, kill. At this moment, a wave of figures suddenly materialized from the corner of the northern street. More than 10 wolf riders were howling loudly as they desperately chased a band of mages and warriors. Amongst the escapees were Beecher and the others from the light major of the academy, riding on inferior battle steeds. Hurry and go. Han Shua immediately reacted after pausing momentarily. He lifted the reins in his hand and the battle steed trotted out with dull, hasty clops as it changed directions once more to charge towards the north. Fanny and the others were tongue-tied as they watched Han Shua's dog-eat-dog performance. Seeing Han Shua suddenly rush out, they too understood that the situation was dire. They also urged their battle steeds to follow behind Han Shua, paving their escape to the north. Han Shua's crew made their way to a large canyon after half a day's worth of frantic galloping on the back of their horses. The sides of the canyon were steep, and a vast river was at its end. Han Shua and the others reined in their battle steeds at the end of the canyon and gazed at the river's azure waters, suddenly sinking into a quandary. This should be the Empire's Nerolan River. We can make our way to the city of Balthazar in the southern part of the Empire after crossing the Nerolan River. Balthazar City and Zajoski City aren't too far apart. Although it's not as heavily fortified as Zajoski City, it's sure to have a heavily armed guard. I think we'll be safe as long as we can make it to Balthazar City. Jean creased his brow in thought as he looked at the vast Nerolan River and then suddenly spoke afterwards. In order to make it to Balthazar, we must cross the Nerolan River first, but this Nerolan River is so vast. I think we'll be unable to make it across without a ship ferrying us. Fanny's face was full of anxiety as she sighed while gazing at the azure river waters from afar. Han Shua hadn't said anything after reaching this place and only self-absorbedly rifled through the 2 large bags on the battle steed. The shops of the town of Droll were set up for the adventurers and mercenaries, so the shops mostly sold goods needed for battle. Han Shua took inventory and realized that out of the 2 bags looted from the 2 wolf riders, there were 4 crossbows and more than 10 bolts of the highest quality, 3 daggers of high quality, 2 long swords and mage staffs of ordinary quality, and 3 sets of leather armor designed to be worn next to the skin. Apart from this, there were also a few bottles of healing medicine and all sorts of poisons. Han Shua first picked out the sharp dagger with a sapphire embedded in it and naturally concealed it close to his body. He then carefully put away the bottles of various poisons and finally poured out the weapons and armor out of the bags and onto the ground. He raised his head, looked at everyone, and said calmly, "Put these things away and prepare to fight." The necromancy students and teachers, who had been sighing and frowning in deep thought of potential strategies, all suddenly started at Han Shuo's words. Jean paused and suddenly remembered Han Shuo's performance just now. He exclaimed in surprise and stared at Han Shuo in question. "Brian, did you use the bone arrow magic just now?" Jean's question caused everyone except for Fanny to stare at Han Shuo with a face full of shock. Lisa even squealed with fright and pointed her right finger at Han Shuo with a face full of incredulity. "That's right. Brian, how can you use magic? This isn't the time to discuss such matters. A portion of the Orc Wolf Riders were headed this way. I think those damned Wolf Riders will reach here quite soon. We have a canyon in front of us and the vast Nirolon River beneath us. What we should do now is consider how to handle the Orc Wolf Riders that are about to arrive." Han Shuo's expression was calm as he neatly arranged the weapons that had been within the bags, calmly explaining as he did so. "If it wasn't for you leading us to this forsaken place, how would we be in such dire straits?" Bella glanced at Han Shuo disdainfully upon hearing his words and jeered at him with a cold expression. His brow furrowing, Han Shuo's calm face suddenly grew cold as irrepressible sense of disgust and dislike grew involuntarily in his heart. He lifted his head to look at the mocking Bella and said, "Do you mean my decision was wrong?" Bella had been about to open her mouth and say, "Precisely," when she suddenly realized that Han Shuo's gaze was sinisterly cold. Bella's body shuddered involuntarily upon seeing his gaze was like that of jackals and wolves sizing up their prey. She smiled fearfully and stammered, I didn't mean that." Nodding, a smile found its way onto Han Shuo's face again as he smiled as though nothing had happened. "Since that's the case, everyone pick your weapon. Our mental strength is limited and the casting range of magic isn't as far as crossbows. I think we should first use weapons, and when the weapons are useless, then use magic to attack. Come, let's make some preparations and wait for those wolf riders to come to their deaths." Han Shuo's performance now was quite like the style of someone in charge. This would have originally been a very comical scene. After all, he was an errand slave for the necromancy major and had no right to call the shots. However, after experiencing the horrors of Han Shuo going berserk in the dark forest and his previous cold and cruel killing of the two wolf riders, no one thought it was funny to follow Han Shuo's orders. It was like they were all getting to know Han Shuo all over again. Even Fanny and Jean came docilely over and started to choose crossbows from Han Shuo's hands. No one raised any objections in defiance of Han Shuo. Unbeknownst to anyone, the original errand slave Han Shuo had established authority amongst them, causing them to willingly listen to Han Shuo's directives. Chapter 56. The pain that accompanies the happy fate of a man. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Steep hills bordered the sides of the large canyon with a passage that was 5 meters wide, right down the middle. This kind of location was the best for laying a trap for the wolf riders. Since everyone had agreed with Han Shuo's plans, they all started busying themselves. Han Shuo didn't know much about how to set traps up himself. A group of people first used tough and tensile ropes to set up tripwires and snares along the passageway. Fanny and Jean then used advanced necromancy magics to release an acid bog behind the tripwires. The acid bog spell was an advanced necromancy spell. It could transform a large area of land into a muddy and miry bog. When the acid bog was formed, it would immediately eat away anyone who ventured within, leaving behind only a pile of bones. This was one of the more diabolic advanced magics of the necromancy major. However, a great deal of mental strength was needed in order to successfully cast the acid bog magic. The acid bog's range would differ according to each necromancer's mental strength. Fanny and Jean had teamed up, but only created a bog that measured 5 meters by 5 meters. Judging from how the two of them looked, they were already at their limit. A few large boulders were placed on the top of the hills on both sides, ready to crash down on the arriving orc wolf riders. The bodies of the students and teachers of the necromancy major were all extremely frail and delicate, therefore it was naturally Han Shuo who completed the mission of moving the large boulders by himself. After making these preparations, Jean, Bella, Bach, and a few others took cover and laid in wait on one side of the passageway. Han Shuo, Fanny, Lisa, and a few others were in charge of the other hill. You've changed a great deal now. If we make it back alive to the academy, your contribution will be the greatest. I'll be sure to report this to the school authorities and obtain some rewards for you. Fanny's body was crouched behind a large boulder and patrolled her eyes over Han Shuo's body, whispering as she did so. Han Shuo was in the middle, with Lisa on his left and Fanny on his right. The three were very close together, and when Fanny spoke in a low voice, her breath smelled like the fragrance of orchids and directly breathed onto Han Shuo's right cheek. The faint perfume made Han Shuo's heart caper like a monkey and mind gallop like a horse. He suddenly felt that this time's danger was also full of gentle charm. He scratched his head out of habit and smiled honestly, turning his head to boldly stare at Fanny's charming features. Fanny's hair was tousled and messy at this moment, and her face was a bit pale after expending quite a bit of mental strength to cast the acid bog. This was in stark contrast to her usual alluring beauty and overbearing air, bringing out another type of beauty for Han Shuo to see. Damn it, I'm talking to you, stop staring at me. Fanny grew angry when she saw that Han Shuo was staring at her, mesmerized and not paying any attention to her. This fellow is becoming even more bold. He even dares stare so insolently at me now. Heh heh, Master Fanny, you're so beautiful. It won't cost you anything if I stare at you, so why must you be so stingy? Han Shuo flirted with a light laugh. A sudden wave of pain traveled from Han Shuo's left arm. His face turned wry and he turned his head to cast a glance at Lisa. Upon seeing that Lisa was staring at him viciously, he hastily squeezed out a smile and said, "Of course, Lisa, you're also very beautiful, heh heh." Holding her head high with a light snort, Lisa glared at Han Shuo and said huffily, "Don't think that I can't take you down a notch now that you're stronger." Humph. Since we have some free time now, hurry and tell me how you came to have mental strength and even mastered the bone arrow magic. How many secrets have you not told me? What secrets? I could master the bone arrow magic thanks to you. If it wasn't for you using the agony of the soul and torturing me half to death, I would definitely still be as useless as before. Thanks to you. Her face saddening, Lisa suddenly hung her head and sighed lightly. She said in a low voice, "You still haven't forgiven me. I know you've always hated me for using the agony of the soul on you, but I didn't mean anything by it originally. I didn't know either that it would almost kill you. No, I really don't blame you. Stop thinking crazy thoughts, Lisa. It's not like you don't know my feelings towards you. How could I hold a grudge against you?" Han Shuo started and suddenly remembered his role and hastened to speak words of comfort to Lisa. Just at this moment, Han Shuo's right arm also felt the same pain and he turned his head to see Fanny's slender jade fingers were also forcefully pinching him. A wave of wryness rose from his heart as he sighed silently, thinking that the happy fate of a man was indeed something that couldn't be enjoyed. He asked wryly, "Master Fanny, what's wrong now?" Fanny also started slightly upon hearing Han Shuo's words and thought, "What's wrong with me? What do the two of them talking have to do with me? How come I also couldn't resist the urge to pinch him?" She flung her head slightly and also snorted, then pasted a faint smile on her face and raised her voice slightly. "Lisa, what did he mean by the bit about his feelings towards you just now?" A panicked expression suddenly appeared on Lisa's face as she hurriedly waved her hands in concealment. Nothing. Master Fanny, you must have misheard. Isn't that so, Brian?" She didn't forget to throw a threatening glance at Han Shuo in warning after she spoke, indicating that you're dead meat if you dare speak of it. Nodding his head wryly, Han Shuo glossed over the matter. He smiled, "Yes, Master Fanny must have expended too much mental strength and something must have developed, causing interference with your hearing. Is that so? Fanny looked suspiciously at Han Shuo and asked with an odd tone. Of course, of course. Oh right, Master Fanny, when we return to the academy, I'd like to remove my status as a slave. I've earned enough gold coins in the dark forest this time and don't want to bear the status of a slave forever. Don't worry, if we can really safely return to the academy this time, I will contact the authorities on your behalf. Not only will we remove your status as a slave, but I'm going to remove your status as an errand boy as well. You'll be a student in the necromancy major in the future and I will personally teach you more advanced necromancy magics. With your potential, I think your future accomplishments will definitely surpass that of all the current students in the necromancy major. Fanny looked at Han Shuo with gratification and gave him a resolute promise. She thought privately, when he becomes a necromancy major student and if his magic increases rapidly, then he'll be able to truly throw off his current shackles. At that time, maybe. What am I think about? Looks like I've truly expended too much mental strength. Otherwise, why would I be thinking such crazy thoughts? Han Shuo had had an overjoyed expression on his face, but at this moment his brows suddenly furrowed and he closed his eyes, concentrating silently for a moment. He suddenly called out to the other side, Master Jean, be careful, I can already hear dull footsteps. I think the Orcs Wolf Riders will be arriving soon. Understood, you guys need to be careful as well. Brian, Master Fanny, and I have just expanded a lot of mental strength, so you'll have to protect Master Fanny well. Don't worry, since Master Fanny is by my side, unless I die first, Master Fanny won't suffer a bit of harm. Han Shuo felt more pain on his left arm as soon as he'd finished speaking. He knew immediately that Lisa must have taken action in her anger. He hastily turned his head to the left and explained to Lisa. However, he didn't notice that on his right, Fanny's gaze at him at this moment had subtly gained a few hints of complicated emotions. Finally, the dull footfalls slowly traveled in from the distance. Even the ordinary students and teachers of the necromancy major had heard those repressed, dull sounds and all involuntarily concentrated their attention, fully focused on how to spring the sudden attack afterwards. Damn it, why is it Beecher and the others from the light major? Just as everyone was holding their breath in concentration and were about to roll the giant boulders down the hills, Han Shuo's sharp eyes suddenly realized that the incoming people weren't the Orc Wolf Riders, but rather Beecher, Irene, and the others from the Academy's light major, who happened to be fleeing in stricken, bedraggled panic. A few unfamiliar mages were mixed in, and then all rode shrilly whinnying battle steeds that looked like they were about to collapse. Expressions of extreme weariness were on all their faces. Fanny frowned and suddenly poked her head out from behind the giant boulder. Her slender neck stretched out as she yelled loudly, Master Beecher, stop immediately. There are traps here that we've laid down to deal specifically with the Wolf Riders. Beecher and the others hurtling towards the tripwires hastened to stop themselves in that crucial moment after hearing Fanny's words. Beecher lifted his head to look at the necromancy students and teachers on the two sides of the hill and immediately understood the situation. He shouted out, the Orcs Wolf Riders are right behind us. What should we do? Give up the horses and make them continue running. Then walk quickly across, we'll tell you where the traps are. Otherwise if you stay where you are, only death awaits you. Han Shuo stuck out his head and called back calmly. Beecher and the others only hesitated momentarily upon hearing Han Shuo's words and then all moved according to his instructions. They dismounted, used daggers to prick the battle steeds' behinds and rushed them onwards after the horses had been pricked. Following that, their crew frantically traversed the tripwires and acid bog under Fanny's voiced reminders and swiftly climbed up the hills on the two sides. Another wave of dull footfalls once again traveled into everyone's ears. This time, everyone knew that it was sure to be the Orc Wolf Riders chasing in hot pursuit. Conceal yourself well and prepare to fight. Han Shuo called out loudly as everyone carefully hid themselves, planning on giving these Orc Wolf Riders, who were used to pillaging, killing, raiding and looting, a lesson in blood. Chapter 57. Killing and Robbing. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. A dust cloud formed in the distance as dull footfalls sounded in everyone's heart like a dull drum. A row of gleaming longswords first came into view, followed one by the sight of the strong orcs' bodies straddled atop their giant wolf mounts. These orc wolf riders had obviously already gone through a round of looting. The bags on the giant wolves beneath them were bulging at the seams. It looked like the shops in the town of Droll had surely been raided until not even a single shingle remained. Perhaps it was because the wolf riders were carrying too many spoils of war, but the speed of the giant wolves beneath had obviously been affected. This was why Beecher and the others, who were riding spindly battle steeds, had been able to make it here. Behind the giant rock, Han Shoa gripped a tough and powerful crossbow, calmly focusing at the most stalwart orc who was leading the group. On his side, Fanny was also holding a crossbow and constantly changed the direction she was aiming at, resolute light sparkling in her eyes. It looked like when faced with death, Fanny also knew to steel her heart. Lisa's hands were empty, but she, along with all the other students, had large boulders next to them. These boulders had been placed appropriately by Han Shoa earlier. All they needed was a strong push to send them rolling, and they were sure to wreak havoc and devastation that was even more frightening than the crossbows. Accompanied by the howls of the giant wolves, a column of more than 10 wolf riders were as swift as the wind and quick as lightning as they finally appeared at the entrance of the passageway. Their speed was ferociously fast and they hadn't expected that an ambush would be sprung on them. They all swung their longswords and yelled out wildly, spurring on the giant wolves and rushing over. Awoo awoo awoo. Some of the leading wolves had their front legs suddenly checked by the tripwires as their front legs buckled and lost balance. They emitted desolate howls as the 4 wolf riders, carried forward by their momentum, suddenly flew off the backs of their giant wolves. Papa papa. The 4 orcs waved their arms wildly as they uncontrollably landed directly into the acid bog in front, landing with resounding, dull sounds. The 4 orcs, who had landed in the acid bog, also emitted ghastly screams similar to their giant wolves. As they wailed like ghosts and howled like wolves, it was as if acid had been poured on their strong bodies. Their flesh, blood, hair, and even their clothes were all turned into bloody water and flowed quickly into the acid bog. The 4 orc wolf riders had turned into 4 enormous skeletons within the span of a brief moment. These 4 orc wolf riders were only the first ones to be so unlucky. 3 more wolf riders behind them were unable to stop their charge in time and also flew into the acid bog. They too turned into 3 skeletons in the blink of an eye. This acid bog is worthy of the title of advanced necromancy, all right. Master Fanny, you're amazing. You must teach me this magic when we make it back to the academy. Han Shoa said in low excitement to Fanny upon seeing that the acid bog was so malicious. However, he suddenly realized that Fanny's face was ghastly white after he'd finished speaking and noticed that her gaze towards the acid bog wasn't quite right. He used his body to bump into Fanny and asked again, Master Fanny, is everything all right? Fanny abruptly recollected her senses after being bumped by Han Shoa and said frantically, No, nothing. This is the first time I've tried casting this acid bog magic ever since I mastered it, and I really hadn't thought that this magic would be so pernicious. Just as Han Shoa and Fanny were talking, the 10 or so orc wolf riders had all crashed into each other in chaos and confusion because the front had abruptly hauled on the reins, stopping their giant wolves, whereas the wolf riders in the back couldn't halt their charge. A few orcs fell off their giant wolves due to the impact. But this way, the tripwires and the acid bog lost their purpose. The orcs attempted to regain their footing and formation as they called out in the din of voices and in the midst extremely crowded panic. Kill! At this moment, Han Shoa suddenly gathered his strength and roared out loudly. Lisa and the others had already busily sharpened their weapons and were itching for action. When they heard Han Shoa's shout, they too yelled out raucously as they pushed the giant boulders beside them down the hill. More than 10 boulders leveraged a momentum that had an imposing manner, which flared up at the skies, and alternately rolled or flew down at the orc-wolf riders below, accompanied by enormous rumbling sounds. Suddenly, the orc-wolf riders, who had been the hunters, became the prey instead. Those rolling, large boulders became murder weapons that took lives and swiftly reaped the lives of the orcs. The orcs were already crowded like sardines and hadn't had the chance to properly reorganize their formation again. Faced with the descent of giant boulders, they immediately paid a heavy price. For giant rocks rained down on them and directly smashed 6 orcs, and their giant wolf steeds, into a blood mess. The rest of the large boulders followed the downhill slope of the hill with a ferocious momentum. When they crashed into the wolf riders, strings of agonized shouts and wails sounded out. When this wave of giant rocks had finished, another 15 wolf riders had died immediately. Another 10 or so had been drawn into the chaos and suffered injuries of varying magnitudes. As these orcs screamed out in panic and fright, they suddenly discovered that the way back was also blocked off by large rocks. Many figures suddenly revealed themselves on the sides of the hill slopes afterwards and were accompanied by curses and volleys of crossbow bolts and magic attacks. Crude and barbaric orcs. Die. All of you. On the other side, Irene, from the light major, had stood up on the side of the hill and cursed in a low voice with a face full of disgust. She began chanting like magic afterwards and started attacking the orcs with Beecher. It looks like they had finally found a target to vent their frustrations on after facing such relentless pursuit from the wolf riders. At this moment, there were still 30 or so orc wolf riders who were still alive in the passageway. However, these wolf riders had to face the various magic attacks from the 2 sides of the hills. Wielding his crossbow, Han Shoa would shoot calmly as soon as he'd focused on an orc. As long as those orcs were hit by Han Shoa's crossbow bolt, they would still fall down in the short term, even if they hadn't suffered a hit to a vital organ. They would never stand up again. How come the orcs that you've hit all never stand up again, even if they've only suffered a grazing shot? The ones I've hit, as long as I haven't hit a crucial part, suffer only minor discomfort. On the side, Fanny creased her brow and asked in confusion after observing the situation for a bit. That's a given. I took some time earlier to sprinkle some poison dust on my quiver of crossbow bolts. They're absolutely done for if even a tiny bit gets on them. Han Shoa accurately shot and killed another orc and explained faintly, as if nothing was amiss. Fanny started when she heard his words, and then angrily pointed at Han Shoa, saying viciously, You're a bit despicable all right. Where did you learn such evil methods? We can't use poisoned arrows even if 2 countries fight. This is an unwritten rule of the profound continent. Shrugging, Han Shoa said diffidently, this is a fight between life and death. Being despicable has nothing to do with it. Killing them with the lowest price possible is the correct way. You adhere too stubbornly to outdated rules and ideas. Yes, Brian is right. These damned orcs burned, killed, looted, and raided in the town of Droll. They take advantage of us every winter to raid along the borders of the Empire. There's no need to talk about any rules with them. Off on the side, Lisa suddenly interjected at this moment, obviously siding with Han Shoa's methods. Humph. You 2 brats are both lily-livered. No wonder you've become close. Brian, I'll let it go this time. You can't tell anyone what you've done once you return to the Empire, and you can't do so in the future. Otherwise, if anyone finds out, they're sure to send armed forces to suppress you. Fanny rolled her eyes at both of them and suddenly admonished them severely. Han Shoa understood Fanny's good intentions. The poison powder sold in the town of Droll were all for the purpose of being used against the savage and violent magical creatures in the dark forest. Ordinarily, no one would dare use it against enemies like this in broad daylight. However, Han Shoa only listened to Fanny's reminders and was still quite disdaining internally. If it came down to the wire and his life was endangered, he would certainly still throw caution to the winds and use even more despicable methods. Under the attacks of crossbow bolts and various magics, the remaining orc-wolf riders could only use their crossbows to attack the ambushers on the sides of the hills. However, Han Shuo and the others had fully occupied the advantage of land and numbers. Under the continual onslaught of attacks, the orc-wolf riders fell one by one into puddles of blood, obviously dead as a doornail. When there were only 5 wolf riders left, they finally started to be afraid. The giant wolves were unable to climb past the giant rocks, so the orcs jumped down from the giant wolves, even giving up all the resources in the bags on the wolves' bodies. They started retreating without a care for anything else. Oh no, they're getting away. If they escape, there are sure to be more wolf riders that come by. Everyone chase after them. Han Shuo's facial expression changed drastically upon seeing this situation and hastily yelled loudly, but his body remained where it was standing. Everyone panicked after Han Shuo had spoken and rushed down from the slope, frantically chasing the fleeing orcs. The 3 warriors, that had been hiding, ran the fastest, racing down the rocky slope like they were on flat ground. They sped quickly after them, with a group of mages following them. Beecher was at the head as well as Jean, Bach, and some other necromancy students. They all raised their staffs and ran out. Just as Fanny poked out tentatively with her body and was about to run out from behind the giant rock, Han Shuo suddenly reached out and abruptly wrapped his arm around Fanny's waist in a hug. He asked in a low voice, "It's so dangerous, why are you going?" Fanny's slender waist was suddenly wrapped by Han Shuo's arm, causing her entire body to go numb. She turned her head to see that the other necromancy students, who were also about to walk out, were all looking oddly at her, particularly Lisa. She seemed to be repressing anger. Fanny blanked and grew agitated when she recollected her wits. A red blush flew onto her face and she began struggling fiercely, saying angrily, "What are you doing? Hurry and let go of me. Why are you holding me back? They won't miss us, and don't we have more important things to do right now?" Han Shuo released his grasp and chuckled. What else could be more important? Fanny and the others all asked, perplexed. Collect the spoils of war. The resources in those bags on the giant wolves are all dazzling gold coins when brought to a city in the empire. Han Shuo laughed heartily as his body had already quickly dashed down from the mountain. Fanny, Lisa, and the others were dumbfounded. They lost their hesitation when they saw that a couple other smart strangers were likewise rushing downhill. They all cried out happily and ran to the fallen wolf riders to collect the spoils of war, with nary a thought for their composure or demeanor. Chapter 58. The Function of Skeletal Warriors. You are listening at NovelFull.audio. Souls of the fallen soldiers, heed the Dark Herald's call and reveal your existence. Han Shuo suddenly started chanting a magical incantation as he ran towards the passageway. An ordinary, skeletal warrior appeared in the passageway after his incantation had finished. Upon seeing the skeletal warrior materialize, Han Shuo immediately concentrated his mental strength and gave a command, "Rob them." This skeletal warrior wasn't the one that Han Shuo had refined with magical yuan. Its speed and strength paled far in comparison to the little skeleton. Its bones even creaked and rubbed against each other when it moved. The ink black, little skeleton with 7 bone spurs had caused too much of a disturbance in the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. If anyone were to find out that he had been the one to summon the little skeleton, it was bound to cause a string of trouble for him. Therefore, Han Shuo didn't dare let the little skeleton appear at this moment. "Everyone hurry, otherwise all the items will be taken by someone else." The ones who'd stayed behind included Irene from the Light Major. When she noticed that Han Shuo and the others had raced down, she immediately called out and followed. On the Necromancy Major side, Fanny, Lisa, and the others first started when they saw Han Shuo summon a skeletal warrior and then quickly recollected their wits. They bore expressions of glee and also started summoning skeletal warriors. More than 10 skeletal warriors were abruptly summoned by Fanny, Lisa, and the others. Under the commands from their mental strength, the skeletal warriors all reached out their bony hands and began to pick up the giant bags from the ground. The resources within the Wolf Riders' bags had all been obtained through previous raids. Now that the Orc Wolf Riders were all dead, these bags lacked a master and naturally became free game for whoever grabbed it first. On Han Shua's side, the skeletal warriors lacking in battle strength were finally of some use. Although their speed was slow, a bag still dangled from the hands of every skeletal warrior. As their masters, Han Shua, Fanny, Lisa, and the others naturally didn't sit idly by. Everyone had a bag in their hands, and Han Shua had even grabbed 4 bags, looking like the cat who ate the canary. Han Shua and the others had salvaged 80% of the loot that the Wolf Riders had left behind in the passageway. The other strangers had managed to grab the other 20%. Weapons, armor, and medicines from the town of Droll were all highly valuable items. If taken to the Empire and sold there, they were sure to fetch high prices and rich rewards. After commanding the skeletal warriors to line up in neat rows, Han Shua looked at Fanny with a smile. Master Fanny, with these items and our gains from the Dark Forest, I think the school authorities will look at our necromancy major with different eyes when we return to the academy. Fanny's mood was also exceedingly jubilant at this time, and she had long since forgotten Han Shua's earlier insolence. A gleeful expression was displayed on her face as her eyes flicked a glance at Han Shua, saying lightly, perhaps not. Many of these things are from the shops of the town of Droll. Although the owners of those shops are now either fleeing or dead, if the Empire were to find out about the origins of these goods, they would confiscate them for sure. Fanny's worries were not without reason. Han Shua thought for a bit and suddenly remembered the merchant, Fabian, whom he had met in the Dark Forest. When the two had parted ways, Fabian had left a card with Han Shua so that Han Shua could find him and do business. Fabian was a member of the Buzzed Merchant Guild and should have an appropriate way to properly dispose of the items if they found him. When his thoughts traveled to this point, Han Shua smiled confidently at Fanny and said, Master Fanny, you need not worry. As long as we make it back to the Empire in one piece, I have ways to dispose of these items, which shouldn't leave any traces behind. Fanny looked askance at Han Shua and shook her head afterwards, saying with emotion, Brian, I realize that I can see through you less and less. How many secrets have you hidden from us? How would you have the methods to dispose of these items? Chuckling lightly, Han Shua said, let's speak of these matters later. I think our first course of action should be how to leave this place and speedily return to the Empire. Just as Han Shua and Fanny were talking, Beecher and the others, including Jean, Bach, and those from the necromancy major on the other side, had returned from the distance they'd traveled. Judging from the relieved expressions on their faces, Han Shua knew that the orcs had most likely met their impending doom. Indeed, when Beecher and the others had walked over, he immediately said proudly, everyone relax, none of those orcs made it out. We can finally be at ease for a moment. He was halfway through his words when he suddenly looked around in surprise, exclaiming, what's going on? Apart from the corpses of the Orc Wolf Riders and of the giant wolves in the passageway, all the bags had been split up by the remaining people. Particularly on Han Shua and Fanny's side, a row of skeletal warriors, each holding a giant bag, was especially conspicuous. Fanny was a bit awkward, opened her mouth and didn't know what to say. Finally, in her agitation, she couldn't help but glare at Han Shua and indicate that Han Shua should respond. Walking forward as if nothing had happened, there wasn't a trace of awkwardness on Han Shua's face. He put down the 2 bags on his body and called out to the unfamiliar mercenaries, warriors, and mages who had just returned from afar. He smiled faintly, these are all spoils of battle, brave fighters, come over and take some. Everyone will go their own separate way soon, but we've just repelled the orcs together just now, so let these items be a memento of our battle. Sure, all right. The 10 or so adventurers, who had returned, all cheered simultaneously and ran over excitedly, adeptly picking through the resources in the bags. Beecher and some of the other light major students had been about ready to join in their ranks when they saw Irene and the others also held stuffed bags in their hands. They started and began walking over to Irene. Little fellow, you're a swell friend. If you ever require the services of our Battlewolves Mercenary Company in the future, don't hesitate to speak up. Heh, I'm very happy to become friends with you. If you need any medicines in the future, just come find me. These people all chatted and laughed in high spirits when they poked through the items as numerous cards with contact information made their way into Han Shoa's hands. Master Fanny, why are we giving those items over to them? What's wrong with Brian? A necromancy student, Athena, was watching Han Shoa's open bags with a look of pain as she asked huffily. His methods are absolutely correct. If we swallow all these resources ourselves, these people won't gain anything at all and will be sure to report this matter to the Empire. Perhaps they might even think of robbing us in their anger. We'd be in dire straits then. Brian has taken out only a small portion right now for them to choose what they will. Doing so also drags them down with us and shuts everyone's mouth. They don't have space rings and can't summon skeletal warriors like us for manual labor, so they can't take much at all. In the end, we still benefit the most, and he's also won the friendship of these adventurers. The Brian of now is truly becoming stronger and stronger. Fanny's beautiful eyes had continually been focused on Han Shoa's figure, who was talking and laughing with the adventurers as she explained to the perplexed Athena. He's becoming more and more mysterious. I wonder where he's learned all these random bits of knowledge, and his knowledge actually has some use. Lisa looked at Han Shoa, remembering the secret way he'd taught her to round out her chest, and whispered with a hint of emotion. Alright, since everyone's taken their pick, let's split up now. I won't be shy if there are any ways in which I need your help in the future. Han Shoa was chattering happily with an air of familiarity on the other side. The 4 large bags on his body were basically empty. These mercenaries and adventurers had all more or less benefited some and gained items they needed. As they looked at Han Shoa, they felt that he looked incredibly pleasing to the eye. Everyone left one by one after finally exchanging a round of pleasantries. Beecher and the others also left carrying their loot after coming by and thanking Fanny. Jean finally spoke up in wistful regret when there was only Han Shoa and the others left in the area. I would have stayed had I known earlier. If we hadn't left, then the bags in the hands of the light majors would be ours for sure. Fanny had no comment for Jean's regret and suddenly felt in that moment that even though he had quite a few years on him, his intelligence seemed to not even measure up to Han Shoa's. An involuntary wave of contempt grew in her heart. Right, what should we do now? Fanny's eyes looked at Han Shoa and the question came naturally out of her mouth. Raising his head to look at the vast Nirolon River, Han Shoa thought for a moment and said lowly, there are a few towering trees in the canyon below. There are various sharp weapons in our bags and a few tensile bundles of rope. We'll be able to swiftly construct wooden rafts if we fell a few trees. We'll be able to travel the Nirolon River with the rafts and directly make it to Balthazar City. I see, then why didn't you tell the others just now? Jean suddenly asked upon hearing Han Shoa's words. What business is it of mine if they want to leave? Besides, when they leave, they'll be able to draw the orcs' attention away from us, decreasing our danger. Isn't this good? Han Shoa smiled faintly and explained matter-of-factly. Fanny, Jean, and the others were all dumbfounded by his words and privately reflected that Han Shoa was indeed different now. When he had been conversing and laughing happily with others, he'd been inwardly plotting against them already. Jean, Bach, and Bella suddenly all looked at each other, thinking of what they'd done to Han Shoa in the past. A chill simultaneously gripped their hearts. Chapter 59. Gifting you a necklace. You are listening at novelfull.audio. With the aid of the dark creatures, the operation of felling trees to construct wooden rafts only took half a day under Han Shoa's command before it was fully complete. 5 wooden rafts and 10 wooden oars all entered the water with the efforts of the skeletal warriors. Everyone boarded the wooden rafts after all 13 bags had been placed securely on them, and started rowing down the Nirolon River with oars in hand. Han Shoa, Fanny, and Lisa were all on one raft, and Fanny had summoned a zombie warrior to row. The three of them lounged leisurely on the sturdy wooden platform, admiring the view of the Nerolon River in a satisfied manner. It was already dusk, and the glow of sunset painted the sky. The deep, blue waters of the Nerolon River were calm, and a few bold fish leapt out to draw silver lines on the water surface. The towering trees in the distance were covered with leafy boughs, and a few unknown insects called out happily, putting everyone into a quiet and calm state of mind. As Fanny and Lisa chattered and laughed quietly, admiring the view on all sides, Han Shuo sat cross-legged on the wooden raft with his eyes closed, silently training his magical yuan, not giving up even a single second that could be used to strengthen and reforge his body, continuously opening up the passages in his body. Fanny and Lisa originally had a belly full of questions for Han Shuo, but they didn't disturb him when they realized that he had closed his eyes and wasn't speaking. They actually felt moved by how studious Han Shuo was, thinking that it was no wonder he'd improved so quickly in such a short amount of time. Their beautiful eyes occasionally landed on Han Shuo's body, discussing something in low voices. It seemed that their topic of discussion must have certainly involved Han Shuo. After a long period of silence, Han Shuo abruptly opened his eyes and looked around when he felt that the wooden raft had shuddered. He discovered that the raft had made it across the Nerolon River and arrived in a lush area, thick with shrubbery and trees. Fanny and Lisa giddily directed the dark creatures to move the spoils of battle from the wooden raft onto the shore. When Jean and company were all present and accounted for, everyone cheered and used mental strength to command the dark creatures, rushing towards Balthazar City after the direction had been set. After walking for 2 days straight, the crew finally arrived at Balthazar City. They first found a large hotel and immediately began to shower and change, feasting on delicacies to their heart's content, and retiring happily for the night. Han Shuo's treatment was now vastly different from what it had been when they'd first headed into the dark forest. He naturally enjoyed the most noble treatment, and shared his room with no one. Everyone had even undertaken the task of moving the resources to the hotel's specialized vault with their own hands. No one dared to let Han Shuo do it. The next day, early in the morning. Dondindin. Fanny lived next to Han Shuo and he knocked on her door as soon as he'd gotten up. "Who is it?" Fanny's lazy voice sounded from within the room. "It's me." Han Shuo responded. "Oh, wait a minute. I'll open the door for you after I've finished washing up." Fanny opened her door after a while, wearing a thin, white, silk robe. The long, soft robe thoroughly accentuated her slender and well-endowed body. Her hair was messy and she lazily flicked a glance at Han Shuo, moving aside to let him in. She asked, "What are you doing here so early in the morning?" Greedily staring his fill at Fanny, Han Shuo automatically sat at the round table after closing the door. He smiled and said, "Master Fanny, I was thinking last night that the loot we hold is still too conspicuous in our hands. I wanted to come discuss with you how to dispose of it. It'd also be a good thing if we disposed of these resources sooner. We're not merchants and can't very well bring these items back to the school with us, but these items come from the town of Droll. If we're discovered by others, not only will we not receive any gold coins, but we may be in trouble as well. What should we do?" Fanny's beautiful brows were creased faintly as she spoke after thinking for a while. "If we had a space ring, we'd be able to resolve this problem. Master Fanny, although space rings are precious, there's still got to be a price for them. How much would a regular, smaller space ring cost?" Typically only space archmages have the ability to refine a space ring. The materials needed to refine a space ring are also quite precious, therefore, the prices for space rings are all quite high. Even a space ring that is of a slightly inferior quality will run for at least 1,000 or 2,000 gold coins. It isn't something that just anyone can afford, so you'd best not think these random thoughts. Master Fanny, as an adept mage, most of your necromancy students are from noble families, so how come you don't have even a space ring? Heh heh, although I'm an adept mage, I rarely leave the academy under normal circumstances. My income every year is only a few hundred gold coins, so where would I have the spare change to purchase a space ring? The necromancy major is the weakest major. If these students all came from large noble families, then they wouldn't join the necromancy major. Besides, they haven't graduated yet, why would their families buy a space ring for them? Han Shuo nodded and basically understood the gist of things after Fanny's explanation. It looked like the necromancy students and teachers were all paupers. No wonder they were all so excited when faced with this batch of resources. So that's the case, a space ring costs 1 or 2,000 gold coins. Heh heh, looks like I should get a space ring first. Han Shuo thought about the 2,000 gold coins saved in his crystal card, rubbed his chin for a while as he mused, then spoke as if deep in thought. Rolling her eyes at Han Shuo, Fanny was out of sorts. What gold coins would you have as an errand slave? If you had that much money, would you have been sold and become an errand slave for the necromancy major for 6 years? Chuckling, Han Shuo said, times have changed, who says I'll be poor forever? Don't worry, I have my ways to get a space ring. When he had finished saying these words, Han Shuo surreptitiously looked to the left and right under Fanny's astonished eyes and took out an agate necklace studded with a ruby. The necklace sparkled with a faint, red hue and the ruby was glittering and translucent, an obviously valuable gemstone. Master Fanny, this is for you. Han Shuo saw that Fanny was staring at the necklace in his hands, entranced. He laughed lowly and gave the necklace to Fanny. At first, she was abruptly joyful, and then blushed hotly. When she'd recovered herself, she hastily shrank back and said, I can't accept it. Right, where did you get this? From the Orc Wolf Rider's bags, of course. I have sharp eyes and nimble fingers and saw that a bag was sparkling with red light, and thus discovered this agate and ruby necklace. I thought that since Master Fanny is such a beautiful person, if you were to wear this necklace, it would be sure to display you in an even more charming and alluring light. So I put it away to give specifically to you. Han Shuo's expression was quite normal as he spoke lightly. This item is too precious, I can't have it, you keep it for yourself. Fanny's beautiful face was flushed red as her beautiful eyes stared closely at the necklace, but her mouth stammered words of refusal. It looks like that although she greatly liked it, she hadn't fully lost her reason. Take it, I have no use for it as a man. Besides, you've taken care of me all these years, and I've been very thankful to you all along. I finally have the chance to repay you, I'd be very sad if you rejected it. Han Shuo was quite serious as his normal, silly, honest look had disappeared. He spoke quite resolutely. I really can't, you already saved me last time and you've helped me a great deal along the way. How could I accept your things? Ooh, although last time in the pool, you. Fanny rambled a bit as she seemed to remember Han Shuo's mischief at the pool. Her face flushed a delicate and charming scarlet as she flung an eye roll at Han Shuo. Her beautiful figure almost lured Han Shuo's soul away. His thoughts racing, Han Shuo hastily stood up with a strong sense of righteousness. He smiled, you must accept this or I will always feel ashamed and uneasy. I have other matters to attend to, good day. Han Shuo didn't wait for Fanny to deny him again after he'd spoken, and directly pulled open the door to leave. His footsteps gradually faded away into the distance. Fanny was panicking in her heart as her eyes landed on the agate and ruby necklace. Her expression was indescribably odd. Her eyes would be resolute 1 second, and tender the next. Then her face would flush angrily as another, complex emotion continuously played out on her face.